Welcome, dear students. Today I want to give you a brief idea about grand challenges for cities related to sustainable development. I will do so in three parts. In the first part, I want to give you a rough idea why sustainability or sustainable development matters and why it especially matters in cities. In the second part, I want to present you some exemplary challenges of cities related to sustainable development. And finally, in the last part, I want to give you some ideas about principles that can guide the development of cities in this or related to this idea of sustainability. Well, why is sustainable development relevant? Why are we talking about sustainable development? There is a new era, or some researchers say that there is a new geological era that is called the Anthropocene. And the new thing in this Anthropocene is that humankind started kind of departing from the Industrial Revolution to dramatically influence its environment on a large scale. Before that, mankind mainly influenced its environment on a small scale and try to survive in an evil environment. But now, departing from this Anthropocene, mankind dramatically influenced its environment, for instance, in changing its climate, in changing water cycles, etc., etc. Well, if we say we live in the Anthropocene, then it's important that we understand the co-evolutionary process between the anthropogenic system on the one hand side, which is the system of humankind and its built environment, and the natural environment on the other hand. That means, how does the anthropogenic system influence the natural system or the natural systems, and what are the impacts of the changed natural system on our well-being and on the anthropogenic system? Again, given the example of climate change, how do we change our climate in driving our car, in emitting CO2 emissions? And on the other hand, how does a changed climatic situation influence the anthropogenic system? Well, if we have this Anthropocene, then cities play a crucial role within this Anthropocene. Just three figures that will indicate why cities play a crucial role in the Anthropocene. You see here that there are trends that show that in 2050, 70% of all people living on the planet Earth will live in cities. Another number is that 70% of global CO2 emissions are generated in cities. And finally, a final number is that 75% of the global economic output is produced in cities. In the previous part, I have presented you a rough idea why sustainable development is relevant in this Anthropocene where humankind dramatically influences its own environment on the large scale. And now in the second part, I want to present you some exemplary challenges of cities within this Anthropocene. But before I come to the challenges, the question is, why do people live in cities? And one theory or one reason why people live in cities is that cities are places where certain basic functions can be provided to people in a very efficient way. On this slide, you see different basic functions, or some of the fundamental functions that are needed by cities. First, people come to cities to work. Cities provide an environment where people find places to work. It's also a place where communication happens, communication between people. Another basic function is to transport, both transporting people from A to B, but also transporting goods from A to B. Another basic function is to nourish, and the last one I want to mention here is to reside. And related to the provision of these different functions, or the services that relate to these different functions, there are certain challenges. I won't have the time to go into detail of all of the challenges cities face with regards to sustainability. But I want to touch on three different kind of clusters of challenges in cities. The first cluster of challenges relates to energy and climate. With regards to energy, it becomes rather obvious that it is a huge challenge for cities to kind of fulfill the demand of energy if you see that 2/3 of the global energy that is needed is demanded by cities. That means a tremendous amount of energy is needed in cities, and we need to find new ways how this energy could be provided to cities. An interesting aspect is that in the structures of cities and in structuring the cities, you can dramatically influence the demand of energy in cities. One interesting example is that you can empirically show that in denser cities there is a lower energy demand than in less dense cities. That means in already developing the cities and structuring the cities, you can influence the demand of or for energy. The next aspect I want to mention is climate. One interesting aspect is that cities have kind of an own microclimate. That means you have phenomena in cities like something that's called the urban heat island. The urban heat island describes an effect that you find in cities, temperatures that are often 2 to 3 to even higher degrees higher than in its surrounding area because of the sealed area of the cities and the built structures of the cities. There are other phenomena like you have certain wind patterns in cities that kind of influence this microclimate of cities and also influence the living in cities. This microclimate combined with the effect of a potential increase in temperature due to climate change will lead to new challenges like heat waves that will be there in cities, like heavy precipitation, that means that more water evaporates from the ground in cities, and the rise of the sea level will also influence cities because most of the cities worldwide are built on the shorelines of oceans. A second challenge or cluster of challenge is related to the urban metabolism. Well, what is the urban metabolism? The urban metabolism tries to understand a city as kind of an organism that needs certain resources that come into this or that feed into this organism, and that you then have outputs out of the city with waste and emissions that have an influence on the environment. And this urban metabolism can't be only understood in looking at the cities, but it needs to be understood when looking also at the hinterland of the cities. That means the area where the different resources are generated that are then fed into the city. What is the problem with all of that? There is a measure which is called the ecological footprint, and with this ecological footprint, the goal is to measure how much area does a person need for the provision of the different services that this person requires for its well-being. In the example of Londoners you see here and of London, you see that the ecological footprint of London is 293 times the size of London, which is equivalent to 6.63 global hectares, which is the measurement of the ecological footprint. And this is equivalent to 3.5 worlds. That means if everybody on this world would require the same amount of resources and emit the same amount of emissions or produces the same amount of waste, there would be a need for 3.5 worlds. Though we don't have 3.5 worlds, and we have a clear tendency that more people move into urban areas, that means we need to find new ways how this urban metabolism can be structured. A last cluster of challenges in cities should be related to aspects that are not directly linked to the natural environment. But you should also see here that sustainability is also about challenges that kind of relate more to social issues, to social aspects, or to health. These three examples are first social justice, and one example where you see that social justice plays a critical role in cities is gentrification. Gentrification means that neighborhoods in certain cities kind of evolve and the rents increase in these neighborhoods, and only the rich people can afford, after this transition from an original rather poor neighborhood to a more prosperous neighborhood, only rich people can live there, and the poorer people are forced out of this neighborhood. This picture here shows an example of Berlin, where you have several of these areas where you can see these phenomenon of gentrification. Another challenge is equity. And here the picture shows a shack in a slum close to Stellenbosch in South Africa. And it becomes rather clear that related to this shack, it is not that equally distributed, that this shack has access to transport, sanitation, energy, etc., etc., etc. That means there is a huge equity issue. How can we provide these different services to people living in different areas in a city? The interesting point here is that this shack is the so-called I-shack, and this I-shack is an attempt, an experiment where researchers try to develop together with people living in this Ekanini neighborhood, where they really try to develop ways how the people living there can have access to these different services. A last aspect I want to mention here is health. There are also different health issues you find in cities. One example I want to give you are the so-called food deserts in cities. Food deserts are described as areas where people don't have access in a walking distance to fresh food, which is a problem because especially the people living in this area don't have mobility means despite of walking. That means the people living there don't have access to fresh food, which has rather severe influences on their well-being and on their health. A second aspect related to health is the phenomenon of obesity. You see that there is evidence that due to urban structures and the nutrition in cities, there is an increasing rate of obesity in cities, especially among young people, and this also leads to severe health problems. In the previous two parts, I tried to give you an idea why sustainability matters and why it's especially important to think about sustainability when we talk about cities. In the second part, I tried to give you some ideas about exemplary challenges in cities. In this last part of my presentation, I want to briefly touch on ideas how can we develop cities in a more sustainable way. One interesting approach to develop sustainable cities, or in the specific case, sustainable neighborhoods, is the approach of the One Planet communities. This approach of the One Planet communities again relates to this idea of the ecological footprint, because the basic idea of the One Planet communities is how can we create urban environments that allow people to live in a way that, if we assume that all people worldwide would live in that way, that they only consume one planet. Therefore, it's the One Planet communities. And for building this One Planet communities, and you see here the picture of one example in London, which is BedSet, which was developed by an organization that's called Bioregional, is that they say, well, we have 10 principles, and we should follow these 10 principles if we build these sustainable neighborhoods. I don't have the time to really elaborate on all of these 10 principles, but they depart from rather general principles related to our interaction with the environment, like zero carbon emissions, that all of these neighborhoods should have zero carbon emissions, that they should generate zero waste, that there should be sustainable transport systems, but they also include principles such as culture and heritage. That means that we have to consider, when developing these areas, in which cultural backgrounds or in which cultural areas are these neighborhoods located. There is also the issue of equity, which was already mentioned as one challenge related to living in cities, and local economy. How can we really foster local economies? And finally, it's about healthy living in these areas and happiness. Let me end with a short reflections that cities are not static systems, but that they are dynamic systems. And you should always consider, when thinking about sustainable development, and therefore it's not only about sustainability as a state, which can't be achieved, but it's kind of always about a sustainable development, that cities are living systems that change over time. And this change should be considered in the planning of cities, that we have resilient cities and adaptable cities. 3 examples from the reality, from the real world, might give you an idea why this is relevant. The first example is Masdar City. Masdar City is an experiment in Abu Dhabi, a city that is built in the desert. And the basic idea of Masdar City is, well, how can we create an environment where people can live sustainably in a kind of really evil environment? The interesting point with Masdar City is that up to now, Masdar City is more a technical experiment than really a living city. And due to the financial crisis, the final construction of Masdar City will not be finished in 2016, but now it is said that it's 2025. That means it's an interesting thing to think about resilience. Another example, which is kindly closely related to Masdar City, which is also something that's called arc-ecology, architectural ecology, is the city of Arco Santi. The city of Arco Santi was also constructed in the desert, but in a different desert, in the desert of Arizona. And the basic idea was also there, how can we create an environment, an urban environment, that allows people to live in the desert, live a happy and wealthy life in coming closer together and creating new forms of living. I visited Arco Santi 3 weeks ago, and the interesting part was that originally it was planned that 5,000 people should live in Arco Santi. Up to now, only 50 people live in Arco Santi. And you also see in Arco Santi that there are clear indications that this experiment was successful to a certain extent, but on the other hand, there were also shortcomings and maybe not enough flexibility that it could adapt to different developments in its context. A final example is Detroit. Detroit, which was a very prosperous city in the US during this time when the automotive industry was big in Detroit. But over the last years, Detroit really faced this challenge of being a shrinking city. That means that people moved out, that it was less prosperous. And just a few days ago, there was kind of this discussion about the bankruptcy of a city, and the White House decided, well, that they save Detroit from running bankrupt, which would have been traumatic for the city of Detroit. But in this getting smaller and in this shrinking, being less prosperous, this also is a tremendous challenge to cities like Detroit. Let me end with a quote of Gary Brewer, and I think this quote might help you or guide you through this development of visions and concrete means to develop an idea of the future and the future of cities. Gary Brewer states, and I think this is true, we can't predict the future. All attempts to predict the future were not successful. However, he states, we can create and invent and make the future, because humankind has done so for millions of years. But if we want to do so, we need to first think about, well, which is the future we wish? And this is about your creations of visions about a sustainable city or the city of the future. And then it's about devising the means to really get to this vision. And hopefully you also find some ideas how we can really get to this visionary cities. Thank you very much.